What's up, gang? Last time we took a look at serif fonts versus sans-serif fonts. But this time we're going to take a look at the individual types of serif fonts and the individual types of sans-serif fonts so you can learn a little bit more about what's going on with these different types of fonts. You ready? Let's dive in. We're going to start by looking at some serif fonts, and we're going to begin with old style serifs, which are the oldest ones that have been in use since the 1400s when the printing press was invented. This sample we're looking at is called Jensen, and what distinguishes an old style font is the nature of the serifs on each letter form. In particular, I want you to notice the D and the B in the word Adobe in the top left. Do you see how the serif at the top of each letter is slanted? So that angular type of serif, that is a hallmark of an old style font. Another little example here would be the E, the counterbar on the E isn't perfectly horizontal. It sits on a little bit of a diagonal. That's another tell for an old style font. But basically you've got a little bit more ornate stuff added to the letters to make it look a little fancier, a little more highbrow. And that is derived from the historical era where writing was not something that everybody could do. Like a sultan might have his own scribe who writes stuff for him. And, the handwriting matters. Everything matters. So this was supposed to be artistic. This was supposed to look really sophisticated. And that's why all the old serif fonts are called old style fonts. And they have these, intricate little details that make them stand out. Here's another old style font. This one is Goody. Once again, notice the diagonal serifs on like the lowercase l, lowercase d. But this one's a little bit different than the Jensen example. The crossbar on the E is horizontal this time, but you will notice a little bit of a counterbalance here. We've got thicker and thinner strokes on some of the letter forms. It gives it some character, accentuates roundness. It is an interesting quirk of some of these old style letter forms. And this was also developed as part of a way to show off improvements in printing press design. So if your printing press, for example, could handle the thin lines and the thick lines, that different contrast in the letter forms of a font like Goody, then you had a pretty advanced printing press. So this was one way of flexing back in the day. And now we move into transitional serifs, a newer type than the old style serifs we just looked at. This example is Times New Roman, a font you are undoubtedly familiar with. And what distinguishes this from the old style fonts is notice how the serifs are perfectly horizontal. So like on the capital N, also on the R, and the lowercase letter forms, most of the serifs are going to be perfectly horizontal. But you do have a couple of old style remnants still in here. Notice on the lowercase m and n in the word Roman, you've got the diagonal little serif on the top left side of that letter form, also in the lowercase r. But you can see this is transitional because they're getting away from those diagonal serifs and starting to use some horizontal serifs. And this in particular is known as the Roman style. The way this is done here with a very slight fillet, the rounded top side of the little serif on the bottom part of the letter, how that's rounded just a little bit. This is a good example of a transitional serif font. Let's look at a more modern example of a transitional serif font. This one is Georgia. It's been installed on every computer since the 1990s. Very ubiquitous serif font. Looks very good on digital screens. It was designed for digital screens in 1997 by a guy named Matthew Carter, who has produced fonts for Microsoft for many years. He's a great guy in the typography realm. Anyhow, once again, we have really subdued serifs on these letter forms, but you'll notice like the lowercase r, as opposed to the Times New Roman sample, the lowercase r and lowercase m have horizontal serifs instead of the diagonal holdover artifacts from the old style serif. So this is a fully transitional serif font. And we move on to the modern style of serif font, also known as a Didone style. This style is characterized by tall verticals on the letter forms and really stark contrast in some of the lines. So like the vertical line on the D, the capital D in the top left, notice how that is contrasted with like the top of the O letter form, the top of the rounded part of the D. Those are very, very thin lines contrasted with the very thick vertical strokes of the main parts of the letters. Also notice these types of fonts, these modern serifs, have what is known as hairline serifs. It's just a single line drawn out from the letter to accentuate the letter forms, but they're very, very thin. So those are known as hairline serifs. That is a key feature of a modern serif font. Here's another modern serif. This one's called Bodoni. It's very similar to Dido, which we just looked at, except for the thin parts of the strokes aren't quite as thin on these letter forms. One of the big criticisms of modern serifs is that they're not particularly legible. In fact, it's very hard to read. If you had a long passage of text presented in this type of font, it would be very hard to read. So generally, you're only going to find modern serifs in use in headlines or in titling or maybe even in like embossing on the front of a building, something like this. You are not going to find modern serifs in use for very long passages of text. It's just too hard to read. And now we reach my favorite type of serif font. This is a slab serif. This one's called Sentinel, but what distinguishes a slab serif is the very thick serifs at the ends of the letter forms. We just saw modern serif fonts with hairline serifs, and this is like the ultimate contrast to that. These slab serifs have super chunky serifs on the ends of the letter forms. But especially in like the black weight, the heavyweights, I think these fonts really look good. They look great in using them for headlines or sub-headlines on web pages. They're really easy to read. This is a great font. Here's another example of a slab serif. This one's called Stag. I believe this was originally developed for Esquire magazine. They wanted to present their headlines in this beautiful text. And now this is available for public use. You can buy this font if you want, but I love Stag because of the kind of muted and understated serifs. You can still tell they're there, but they don't really dominate. And then you just got these big chunky letter forms that have a really high impact. They're easy to read. This is another great font. All right, gang, we have reached the sans serif portion of our program, and we are going to start with a type of sans serif font known as a grotesque. And this is Helvetica, probably the premier example of a grotesque font. But this name actually comes from really old school terminology, and that's because people regarded letter forms without serifs as being somewhat gross, and that's where the name grotesque comes from. But it's funny, these were regarded as being robotic and harsh and kind of devoid of character. This wasn't something that was considered like human facing. This wasn't warm. People didn't really like sans serifs when they first came out, but there were some practical reasons why they were developed. We'll get into some of this stuff in a bit, but suffice it to say, you're looking at Helvetica, probably the most ubiquitous font in existence today. Let's move on. Here's another grotesque sans serif. This one is called San Francisco. This is the current operating system font for Apple computers. It's also found on the iPhone. This is, just another quintessential grotesque sans serif with thick lines, really clear letter forms, a tall X height, meaning the height of the lowercase letters is tall relative to the uppercase letters. That makes it easier to read in digital environments, which this was developed for. And as you can see, it kind of is drawing from Helvetica. It's similar, but a little bit different. I find San Francisco to be a little bit more pleasant, but the differences are subtle. If you go back and forth to the other part of the video and pause it, you'll see that these two fonts are very similar, as are most grotesque fonts. We move on to geometric sans serifs, which emerged as a response to the rigidity and the robotic nature of grotesque letter forms, which didn't really have much character, and again, were like boxed in a way that made people uncomfortable. So what characterizes a geometric sans serif is rounder open forms, so like an O, capital Q, lowercase a, lowercase q, all these things that have rounded elements. They are more close to being exactly round in geometric sans serif fonts. This is something people don't really know. You kind of assume an O is round, but in almost every font, O's are actually much more vertical than they are horizontal, so they're oval in shape. But this font, Futura, and other geometric sans serifs were kind of explorations of what would happen if we used more geometric shapes to make our letter forms. And another geometric sans serif here. This one is Gotham. This is my all-time favorite font. I just love the way the bold weights of this font look. So powerful and strong. The letter forms are just perfect. Like that lowercase a is chef's kiss on that one. I just love these letters. The lowercase g is so good. There's just little subtleties here. I even love the numbers, especially the 3 and the 4 there. You see those? Those are good. Gotham is a great font, a geometric sans serif. And we move into our last type of sans serif font. This one is known as a Humanist style font. So we're looking at Gill Sans right here, maybe the best example of all Humanist sans serif fonts. What distinguishes a humanist sans serif away from the grotesque or the geometric sans serif is the use of accents on some of the characters, such as the lowercase a, which is easily the most famous letter in the Gill-Sans alphabet. That little hook on the A has been hotly debated in typographic circles for decades. But you also have like the G, the shape of the G is derived from calligraphy and also from serif letter forms. So the humanist movement sought to bring in some of the elements of serif fonts that made them more human and made them more artistic. And Gill-Sans is a preeminent example of that. Here's some bonus material. If you have ever heard of famous visual designer Edward Tufte, he used Gill-Sans in all of his works. I guess he just loved the font, but anything Edward Tufte, you will find this font, Gill-Sans. Here's another famous humanist sans serif. This one's called Frutiger. And if it looks familiar to you, I can give you a clue as to why. You will find this font in just about every major European airport. It's in Charles de Gaulle in Paris, it's in Schiphol in Amsterdam, and it's in Frankfurt. And I don't know if it's in any of the other ones, but I bet it is, because this was used in signage throughout Europe from the 1970s onward. Look for Frutiger in public places. I've got one more little treat for you in the humanist sans serif category, and you are looking at the bottom font here. That is known as Clearview Highway. This font was developed in the early 2000s to replace all of the road signs in the United States. The idea was to make the letter forms more legible and to reduce visual artifacts like glare and where it's run-in, where the letters kind of run together and it's hard to tell the difference between two letter forms from far away. It was designed to reduce those types of things for drivers on the road. So the top two fonts shown here are examples of the older interstate signage in America, and the bottom one is Clearview Highway. And I want to point out a couple of the elements that really make this font what it is. The thing that stands out the most to me is the lowercase l. You've got like the little curvature on the bottom of that thing. It extends out to the right. That's how you can distinguish it from numerical 1, which is oftentimes a problem with sans serif fonts. And the cap of the L is actually slightly higher than the cap height of normal letters, and it's also higher than the T, which a T is more easy to distinguish visually. So they use little tricks like this within the font, extending certain letter forms, adding little curvature to some things, so you can really tell with certainty what various letter forms are. Also, I want you to look at the open part of the A at the top and the open part of the G at the bottom. These are known as counters in typography. Both of these would be called open counters, as there's no element that totally hooks over and like encloses that interior space. You see that that interior space, that if there was air in there, it could easily escape because there's no closure on those letter forms. That is something else that aids legibility at a distance, and that is a huge reason why Clearview Highway was developed. Another little nugget. AT&T liked this font so much that they chose to use this for their branding, and I think around 2003, 4, or 5, somewhere in there, they licensed this font, a variant of it called Clearview AT&T, that they still use in their branding today.